are joining us. Good evening for recording. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, waiting for folks to make their way from the waiting room into the main room. While you're at it, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Thanks for joining us this evening. All right, I'm going to get us started as we wait for a few more folks to join. But thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. My name is Rachel Swanteson-Franz. I'm a board member, an at-large board member with the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates, and I'll be moderating tonight with our awesome panelists. So thanks for joining us. Folks are introducing themselves in the chat. Thanks for doing that. Keep doing it. You'll notice you won't be able to unmute yourself, and that was for security reasons. So you're just going to have to use the chat to communicate with everyone. Include, that's going to be where you're going to put in all of your questions for the panelists, which we will answer in about 20 minutes at the end. We will also have a survey after, so when you leave the Zoom room, you will get directed to a survey. Please take the 1 or 2 minutes to fill that out because it really helps us in making these webinars and making these as awesome as they can be and helping to reach you all better. So thanks so much in advance for doing that. Also, for folks who want to stay after 8 o'clock, there will be sort of an after and little after event with the advocates and the panelists to learn even more. So feel free to join us. That'll be from 8 to 8:30, but you'll get that survey at the end. And I think we're probably good to get started on this. Do we think we're at a good number of folks, Norm? Or do you want to wait a little bit more? Or Bob? Good?
I think we're good to go.
All right. Well, I'm going to pass it off to Norm, who's going to frame the session for us. How it's going to go is we're going to have 10-minute presentations from each of our panelists. So we have Hannah Riseley-White, who's the Deputy Director of the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. We have Dr. Ladona Clayton, who's the Executive Director of the Ogallala Land and Water Conservancy, and then Norm Gaume, who's the President of the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates. They're going to be presenting on different parts of the Water Task Force, but I'll pass it to Norm first to get us set up.
Thank you, Rachel. I wanted to welcome everybody to this meeting and thank you for participating. I think it's important to frame this meeting appropriately. The task force recommendations have been voted on by consensus and adopted by the task force, but the report is not ready and will be released to the public at near the end of November. In the interim, the water advocates, as well, I was a member of the task force and a co-lead for one of the work groups. I wanted to hold this event to introduce the task force recommendations to you and to also promote them and to ask for your help with the legislature in actually making the recommendations come to pass. So thank you for joining. We have a long way to go, but I think we have a pretty good set of recommendations to request the legislature and the governor to approve in the next legislative session, 2023. And without further ado, let me introduce the panelists tonight. I'm really pleased that Hannah Riseley-White has agreed to join us. Hannah was on the executive committee for the task force, is on the executive committee, and she participated in one of the work groups. Hannah is the deputy director of the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. She's a native New Mexican. She's pleased to be back in New Mexico. She relocated here quite a few years ago after working 20 years on both the East and West Coasts and abroad. Hannah has a fascinating master's degree in environmental science and management from UC Santa Barbara. It's an interdisciplinary degree intended to bridge the gap between science and policymakers, and that's exactly what we are trying to do. So thank you, Hannah, for providing all of the state with your expertise and your leadership. I'm also very pleased to introduce Ladona Clayton. Ladona is a member of the task force. Ladona has lived in Eastern New Mexico for most of her life and in Clovis for 40 years. She's a native New Mexican. She earned her doctorate degree in educational leadership from Oral Roberts University in 2009 and has been in public education for 20 years and private education for 12. She was elected as city commissioner for Clovis in 2016, and she began leading community efforts then to build water resilience. She's done a lot of work. Currently, she's the executive director for the Ogallala Land and Water Conservancy, whose mission is to conserve groundwater resources of the Ogallala Aquifer. So welcome, Hannah and Ladona. And I'm Norm Gaume. I'm president of the Water Advocates. I'm a retired water resources engineer and state and local water official. And we're very pleased to present this, this meeting tonight. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Hannah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Norm. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with this group. And I'm pleased to see so many folks on and people that I know, and also folks that I'm making your acquaintance through the chat. Also exciting to see a few of our other fellow task force members on this evening. So thank you so much. So yeah, again, my name is Hannah Riseley-White. I'm the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission Deputy Director, and I served on the executive committee, or continue to serve on the executive committee for the task force. And Bob, you can go ahead to the next slide, please. So what is the task force? I think a lot of people are very curious what this thing is, right? So this task force was pulled together by our current state engineer and former water policy advisor to the governor, Mike Hammond. It is comprised of 29 members. 20 of those are citizen task force members representing the full range of water uses in the state of New Mexico. The other 9 are state agency reps. So myself as a rep for Interstate Stream Commission, also OSE, Environment Department, MNERD, Department of Finance and Administration, Indian Affairs, Game and Fish. Let's see, who am I leaving out here? Anyways, the full range of state agency reps who work on water related issues. And then we have had significant support from our support team, including New Mexico First, who did the facilitation and convening and made sure that we stayed true to a consensus-based process, as well as the Utton Center, who supported through research, as well as report writing and drafting, which is what is underway now, as Norm alluded to. The task force first assignment really was to develop a charter to define our mission, and we spent largely the first month working on that in particular. We have 2 primary objectives. The first was for the task force to review and comment on the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission's 50-year water plan, and I'll talk to that more in just a moment. But then second, and very importantly, to develop a set of recommendations to address current water policy and management challenges, given what we're seeing with climate change, which is significant. As Norm said, the recommendations haven't been released yet, but will be later this month, and we're very excited for everyone to take a look at them. We are currently in the phase of finalizing the report itself, but also working through coordinating with our legislative advisors. So we also have 8 legislative advisors to the task force. This is a big group, as you can tell, with a lot of smart folks who've been thinking about these issues for a long time. coordinating with them on next steps heading into the session and thinking through sort of phasing. So the task force in total came up with 17 recommendations. We thought we might be lucky to reach consensus on something like 5. So to reach largely consensus on 17 is huge. It's a lot to take on in just the coming legislative session. It probably will have to be phased over the next number of years. So we're in the thick of thinking about what that looks like and how to coordinate that amongst the task force members and our legislative advisors in the coming weeks. And as we've mentioned several times here, this was a consensus-based process. The goal that New Mexico first had was for the recommendations to reach at least 85% agreement across the 29-member task force. And largely, most recommendations did that. We had a couple of people who just didn't vote, but many of them reached 100% consensus of the 27 or more folks that voted. You can go on to the next slide, Bob. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the context, which I think if you're on here and you're paying attention to water, you're already quite aware of. We face some very significant challenges, and I think that was really driven home by the forest fires that we experienced this past summer. Climate change is here. It's not something we're looking into the future. We're needing to prepare for what happened next year, let alone what happens 50 years from now. So we're seeing that very, very consistently across the state in terms of shortages in water supply, declining aquifers, and on top of that, a lot of aging infrastructure, and the need to invest in all kinds of new infrastructure and the ability to manage a changing climate regime. And then a real capacity crisis, both at the state level, but also really in local communities across the state to implement projects and plan and look ahead and prepare for the changes that are coming. Next slide, Bob. And I think the thinking is maybe there's this sort of magic confluence of events that we're seeing right here that could really lay the groundwork for some transformational change in terms of how we fund and support water management across the state. We have unprecedented levels of federal funding coming to the state, aging infrastructure, which I just mentioned, the completion of the 50-year water plan, which is really kind of a call to action for New Mexicans around climate change and what the implications of that may be for our state, the dire conditions that we just experienced and the need for community recovery. And then this opportunity, maybe the political climate is right to be really taking a hard look at how we manage water and make some significant changes. And so the idea is maybe this is a magic moment where all of these things come together and we can really make some significant progress in terms of supporting really proper and well thought out water management in New Mexico. Next slide. So on the first objective of the task force did review a draft plan of the 50-year plan over the summer. It was a July draft, which is nearly complete, and provided comment. That comment will be contained in the report itself that we're working on finalizing. Largely, the response was quite positive to the draft plan. And I want to just clarify, in case there's some confusion out there, Interstate Stream Commission is tasked with water planning. We've supported historically regional water planning, and then by statute, we're also, do state water planning that's updated every 5 years. This is really different. This is a one-off from anything that we've ever done before. This was a governor's initiative, and it was really purely about looking at climate change and what the implications of that would be for the state. And so it isn't extensive analysis related to supply and demand projections, but really a hard look at what does the current science say about what we're facing. And that's where we worked very closely with the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, who convened an expert panel to look at that closely and provide some information that we could use to make some decisions, right? So I'm sure everyone's saying, well, where's this plan? So this plan is currently under discussion with the governor's office. We've been working very productively with Michelle Lujan Grisham's office to add some more specific critical action steps to the recommendations section of the plan. The recommendations are grouped under these 3 categories that you see on this slide: stewardship, sustainability, and equity. But obviously there's a lot of overlap. Everything on here relates to equity, right? So we recognize that, but it was a nice way to sort of group the concepts. The governor's office looked at it and said, we were shooting for something like a 35-page plan. But her staff really wanted us to have some more specificity. So we're in the process of working on that and hoping that it will be released soon after the election. The task force recommendations are their own separate set of recommendations. And it's been really interesting because they've come very much organically out of this 29-member task force. And yet there's a lot of synchronicity and overlap between the recommendations that we at Interstate Stream Commission with all of our partners came up with in the 50-year plan. Next slide. And I'll try to be quick here. So the second objective of the task force was to, as I said, develop our own set of recommendations. The task force self-formed into 3 work groups. So community drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater capacity, infrastructure, and finance. The second group was water resources management and planning, and the third group, river, aquifer, and watershed health. I'd like to point out that all of the panelists this evening were from work group 2, that water resources management and planning group. And so I'm going to speak a little bit to the recommendations that came out of work groups 1 and 3. So the first and last on this slide. Ladona and Norm will speak more to the water resources management and planning recommendations. And I think, obviously we're now in a place where we really worked hard within our work groups, but we're pulling back to really look at this as a whole set of recommendations, how they relate to each other, and what's the appropriate phasing moving forward. Next slide, please. All right, so with regards to community drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater capacity, infrastructure, and finance, which is kind of a mouthful, I think the real driver and the reason that this rose to the surface as its own separate work group is a kind of crisis that we're facing in New Mexico, not necessarily related to funding itself, but about getting the funding out on the ground. So the funding mechanisms that we have and the local capacity to absorb and actually design, implement, and carry out projects is limited. And we're in a bit of a crisis with a lot of communities across the state with aging infrastructure and not having the ability to do this properly. And so a number of recommendations came out of this work group, including creating a new water infrastructure projects authority that would be somewhat modeled after the Public School Facilities Authority, but learning from that lesson, but essentially an entity that could look carefully and vet, prioritize, and help community groups navigate through a funding process in an organized and strategic way. So that's the first recommendation. Another is to support regional water system collaboration. And this is regionalization, informal and formal. So everything from sharing infrastructure in a very official and agreed upon way to like sharing a bookkeeper or someone who does your rate structure or whatever. There's just a lot of need from a capacity standpoint at a local level, and how do we help people in communities share those resources. In addition, there's a recommendation related to enhancing technical assistance support to small communities, and then creating an emergency relief fund. We saw this in the last year, lots of inability to access funding quickly after emergencies occur. So how do we address that looking into the future? And then of course, growing our water workforce. Another capacity issue at the local level is just not enough staff to run sort of drinking water and wastewater systems. Next slide. And Bob, you can actually skip the next one because I'm going to let Ladona and Norm speak to the water management and planning group. So you can skip that one. And then the last work group I'll comment on is river, aquifer, and watershed health. And to be honest with you, this is first, right? I mean, there is no water for us to manage or drink in a lot of ways if we don't have healthy watersheds and aquifers. So 80% of New Mexico's water comes from our upland watersheds. We're seeing significant impact in those areas due to climate change. So how are we planning for that, preparing and supporting, again, capacity at state agencies and local entities across the state to do this well? And so this group came up with a number of recommendations, including funding existing programs. So the Strategic Water Reserve, which is implemented through my office, Interstate Stream Commission, as well as the River Stewards Program at New Mexico Environment Department. Really great policies that exist but are historically underfunded. Also funding the New Mexico Environment Department to develop and implement a surface water quality permitting program, which currently doesn't exist. New Mexico is one of only, I think, 3 states in the nation that doesn't have our own water quality permitting program in-house. Reviewing modifications to New Mexico groundwater law and looking at how we can increase resilience and support communities across the state to manage collectively a shared resource in terms of an aquifer that's shared. And then a number of really strong recommendations related to forest management and thinking through how do we overcome the jurisdictional challenges of watersheds that cross over different land jurisdictions, right? And how are we being strategic and how we're managing and preparing for future forest fire, preventing forest fire and recovering. And then last, not listed on this slide, this group also made a recommendation in terms of funding water education for decision makers and the public as something that just would be really beneficial for our legislators, but also thinking through what that looks like for the general public as well. And I think I'm sure I'm over time with that. I think that was the end of my slide deck. Thank you so much, Bob and Norm and the advocates for hosting, and I look forward to your questions tonight.
Thanks, Hannah. I think you're up next, Dr. Clayton. And you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go. There you go.
Do that. I should have known, but thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so I will move quickly, knowing that time is limited, and I'm going to start my little timer over here to my right. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Bob. So this is just a great place to start, is to talk about New Mexico's water supply. Obviously, Norm has already talked about that to some degree, so has Hannah, and I know Norm will be saying more about this. But it's known that we definitely are dealing with climate change that's resulting in greater aridity and less available water. Our reservoirs, rivers, and aquifers are at or near record lows, and our scientists are projecting an additional 25% decrease in stream flow and aquifer recharge over the next half century. And while they're predicting that, New Mexico's population and economy are changing and growing. The watershed degradation compromises surface and groundwater supplies, and fundamentally what it comes down to is demand exceeds supply significantly. Next slide, please. So the Ogallala Land and Water Conservancy is truly a textbook case, or the poster child for everything I just talked about. Basically is regarding water supply is dwindling significantly where I live. So we were born out of a single action plan that was in the Clovis Master Water Assurance Plan. And the High Plains Aquifer, which exists in the Ogallala, but that's our particular part of that aquifer, is our sole non-charging aquifer, and it's being depleted at an advanced rate. Best way to understand it is to tell you, right now I'm working with landowners in a single paleo channel, and they reside northwest of Cannon Air Force Base. And in this case, we're able to capture 10 of 13 landowners initially this year. And just with those landowners pumping their wells to irrigate their crops, when we took the baseline numbers in 2017 and then came back in 4 years later, the remaining groundwater for the consumptive use, we know that we're going to we've lost approximately, 4 years of remaining groundwater for consumptive use. Because in April 2022, we metered 53 out of the 72 wells because 3 of our landowners weren't ready to come on to this project yet. So we were able to meter 53, and we've already lost 20% of the remaining groundwater in that very significant paleo channel. And so we're working very aggressively to try to cease the pumping. In fact, we ceased the pumping in all 53 wells as of the end of April of this year. And we are preparing to then work with our landowners and continue to extend this to the other paleo channel west of Cannon Air Force Base. And our hope is that we'll be able to conserve that groundwater actually into perpetuity, or as long as it will possibly last. I think the best thing that was said about us is this quote at the bottom of the screen on this slide. And a hydrogeological specialist with the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources said, well, Clovis has pumped themselves into oblivion. And I was at the conference when he said this, and I'm just saying that That is probably a pretty accurate statement, I'm sorry to say. So our goals are, let's secure this groundwater supply while it still exists. It's going to serve as a supplemental supply for Cannon Air Force Base, and actually it provides mission resilience. And this has now become essential to the Cannon Air Force Base existing mission and for the future. It will also support Clovis and Curry County. As I shared, we ceased the pumping currently in one paleo channel, only lacked 3 of those landowners to finish it out. And we're going after paleo channel 2 at the beginning of next year. Then we're going to transition though all the irrigation farming to dry land cropping or grazing land. So we're helping those landowners make that transition because we cannot sustain irrigated farming any longer in this particular area if we're going to conserve that water. We already know, because we've already run the numbers, that we'll save approximately 12 years of water in 3 years' time. That is significant to us, I promise you. So 11,919,031,200 gallons of water, just with these 10 landowners and initially leasing the water from them. Eventually, though, we will be placing 80% of the groundwater that we're conserving in conservation easements in perpetuity. And we have quite a unique plan to do that. And to be honest with you, we're the first of our kind. This is uncharted territory for land trusts or conservancies. And so we're hoping that things go as effectively as they possibly can. Next slide. Water Task Force, talk about the consensus-driven process quickly. Hannah's already covered the 29-member task force and what our work was and how we broke into the 3 work groups. But what it was so amazing about the entire efforts of this group is that really consensus was sought every step of the way. I know every voice was heard and honored because I didn't miss a single meeting. So I got to hear that take place and see that take place. There were multiple opportunities, not single, but multiple for each task force member to identify and share recommendations for consideration. We would deliberate. We had great, rich dialogues. This was a very comprehensive approach. It made cycle upon cycle. That's the best way I can possibly say it, is every time we did it, we would do it again. We would refine the recommendations. We would go back to our team as work task force groups, and then we would refine ours. And a good example of how far we've come is at one point, our particular work group 2, had 89 recommendations on the table, and we got down to 8. And that was an extensive amount of work, discussion, listening, respecting, honoring every step of the way. We used a ranking and voting process, and then we would refine again, and then we would finally reach consensus. And this took hours upon hours, not just together, but behind the scenes with people meeting to try to get there. And so I just really do want to highlight how very well this process worked and how it really did bring all those 29 voices and then some to the table. Next slide. Now I want to discuss our work group 2 recommendations. So I'll say first, all but 1 out of 8 of our work group 2 recommendations received unanimous approval, and of the 1 that didn't, it only had 1 no vote. All of the recommendations, all 8 of them though, did reach consensus. Next slide. I'm going to just give a quick bird's eye view of these. And so the best way I could do that is break them into categories. So we're talking water resilience across the board though, because that was the main focus of our group. This first category, water demand and supplies. Agency is 2.1. So to ensure a water resilient future for New Mexico, and that includes empowering state water management agencies to meet the challenges of the 21st century, which includes water scarcity, aridification, supply and demand imbalances, contaminants, and equity. We had 3 categories. I call this our big comprehensive plan. Out of all 8 of them, this one has the most detail and is the most aggressive, I believe, plan for what it wants to accomplish. So legislation, funding, agency, and local capacity and accountability are big areas that reside under this particular plan. And 2.2 is all about planning. And our team talked continually about the importance of planning. And we're all on the same page. This work cannot be done without extensive planning, and especially elevating regional planning for equity, capacity to govern and manage water. We had a big plan solely focused on funding, although funding cut across many of the plans. We want to leverage federal funds to increase water resilience and modernize water infrastructure for 21st century needs. Next slide, because I'm trying to keep moving. These fall into the category still of water demand and supplies, but they're all agricultural based. And we had a lot of conversation about ending up with things that actually 3 plans that focused on agriculture because it uses so much of the state's water. And I can attest to that as an Eastern New Mexican in Clovis. And what we have had happen is because 93% of our water goes to agricultural producers. And I'm sure you know, we made the National Geographic magazine in 2016, as they highlighted all of our families on the south side of Clovis, more than 30 families that completely ran out of water and had to have water hauled in on a daily basis just to make it day by day. So these plans are looking at supporting the resilience of New Mexico's diverse, let me turn that off. I was trying to get myself to finish up. So I will finish up even more quickly now. I'm just almost there. So they're looking at inclusion in water management, consideration of equity. Equity came up significantly here, water conservation, sustainability, water supply demand imbalances. Some areas that were capitalized upon were rotational fallowing programs, the need for technical resources and staffing. This continually comes up, by the way. This is not the only plan it showed up in. These technical resources, staffing, and even bringing data up to a higher level of how we're getting it and reporting it. Also mentioned in this one is finalizing Indian water rights settlements. And 2.6, enhance irrigation entities' availability of and accessibility to infrastructure improvement funding. And this also included disaster recovery fund. So this is another area that came up in several plans. And finally, employing authorized tools falls under the management tools section, and we have 2 plans that reside here. 2.7 is let's just put the existing tools to work for a water resilient future. That includes capacity, funding, staffing, and education. And I just listed some examples of existing authorized tools that we identified that just need to be put to work. Altogether, we identified 8, but on your screen, you will just see a sampling of those 8. And then groundwater monitoring got a lot of attention in our group as well to protect the quantity and quality of groundwater resources and getting the funding we need to build groundwater monitoring a network. A really robust network is essential, we believe, and really determining, again, how much water do we have and what is its quality. We need to enhance technical capacity and also amp up scientific understanding and use it to our benefit. So I'm going to stop right there. I know I went about a minute over, but thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing any questions.
Thank you, Norm. Passing it to you.
Thank you, Hannah and Ladona. I was a co-lead also for work group number 2, and I'm going to cover those recommendations a little bit, but I'm going to drop back and talk about the whole task force as well. So I think the main point is this set, and it is a set, it's not individual recommendations, it's a set of consensus recommendations. They really show the way to what we need to do. So the task force was able to get on board. I think most of you who are with us tonight would be on board. And our task is to get the legislature and the governor to agree and to make a pivot towards resilience in the next legislative session. Next slide, please, Bob. So again, I boiled the problems down to 4 core problems. We have problems with water supply. We have inadequate community capacity to implement projects and to do planning, to do decisions to operate and maintain existing infrastructure. We have a state government capacity problem. Our water agencies are understaffed and underfunded. And our watersheds, rivers, and aquifers are at risk. Next. The overarching theme of the Water Task Force recommendations is to increase capacity at the local level and at the state level so that we change our ways and that we protect our water. The state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission need to have changed focus, additional capacity, and accountability to productively use the extra funding that is recommended for them to carry out the crucial programs. The main task is to, as Ladona said, is to reduce and manage the gap between water demand and water supply. In many regions of the state, water demand really outstrips any semblance of a resilient supply. The Environment Department and the Natural Resources Trustee need to have the capacity to protect the quality of our water, to clean up existing contaminated water, and that requires staffing that those two entities don't have. Water planning needs to be promoted in New Mexico and radically altered from the planning programs of the past, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. We need to create a state water resilience fund to leverage the federal funding that's available and to provide the non-federal match so that local communities across New Mexico can access this infrastructure funding, and so that projects developed in regional water planning can be implemented. An emphasis has to be resilient agriculture. And we want to also manage our groundwater and aquifers for resilience. Next slide. I believe the way that this is going to shake out is that there will be a bill, and a complex one. It's the recommendation that Ladona emphasized that's really the heart of the water management and planning work group's work. And it needs to deal with the mission and focus of the Office of the State Engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission, modernizing their business processes and information systems, which has many benefits. Benefits to the public for information accessibility, benefits for agency productivity so that Interstate Stream Commission staff don't have to drive to Roswell to view a paper file in the Roswell office of the state engineer. They need more people across the board. And as I mentioned before, I think that given the reluctance of the legislature in the past to fund water appropriately, I think the legislature needs to be assured that if they provide the resources, that the agencies will be accountable for producing results. The bullets I've listed under there are to implement active water resources management. The state engineer has talked a lot about that in the task force process. He needs practical enforcement authority like the Environment Department has today. It's as simple as taking the Environment Department's enforcement authority and copying that into the state engineer statutes. Project implementation support. For example, in the Acequia program, there simply aren't enough staff to put the money that the legislature has appropriated on the ground into projects and to coordinate those projects. And so the bottom line is staff capacity and resources to utilize these existing statutory tools. Water Data Act, Active Water Resources Management, the 2003 State Water Planning Act, and as Ladona said, I believe there were 8 or 9 tools total that we identified that need more staff to fulfill, to basically utilize those tools. The second bill, and who knows how these bills are going to shake out. It could all be one big bill. But an essential task is to amend the 1987 Regional Water Planning Statute. I see that I'm already into the question time, so I'm not going to go over that much more, but suffice it to say that planning needs to be rigorous. It needs to be conducted at the level of the water resource. That means local planning entities. It means water planning staffing, and the state needs to be on the hook for providing the science and hydrology foundation for these robust regional water resilience plans. Next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about the Water Resilience Fund. New Mexico is blessed with windfall revenue this year. And the idea here is to capitalize this fund to provide the non-federal match in order to capture the infrastructure funding. The infrastructure funding is not appropriated to New Mexico. It's available. We have to go after it, and having the matching funding is a big piece of that. The task force decided that there are two types of categories of programs or projects rather that need to be funded this way. And those include existing community projects, which need to be vetted, and then the financing supported through using the Water Resilience Fund to capture a greater amount of federal infrastructure funds. We also need to use the fund to implement projects that are justified in the approved regional water resilience plans that come out of the reformed water planning, regional water planning process. And one idea is to fast track using federal infrastructure funding, a state water infrastructure, groundwater measurement and monitoring program, meaning that we would ask the federal government and the state to fund a network of maybe 200 dedicated groundwater monitoring wells across the state, and in critical basins to also provide the funding to meter all of the diversions. That means metering all of the wells in critical groundwater basins. And then the last recommendation here is holistic and responsive community infrastructure support. New Mexico's small rural communities, and even some of the bigger ones, need this holistic support to help them plan, design, construct, operate, and maintain their infrastructure. And that was a work group 1 recommendation. Next slide, Bob. So I want to close with a call to action. The task force has done its work. It's highly parallel to the recommendations that the water advocates have been advocating for over the last year. And now is the time. We all need to respectfully demand that the 2023 legislature and our governor pivot to protect our water. The pivot needs to be made in 2023, recognizing that it will take several years to fully implement the Water Task Force recommendations. So in 2023, to make this pivot, we need to pass and sign the legislation that I've just very briefly reviewed to authorize, provide statutory direction and criteria. And also in 2023, we need the legislature to appropriate and for the governor to approve the first increment of increased funding and staffing for our water management agencies. We have non-recurring funding, so 2023 is the time to make one-time appropriations of non-recurring revenue that can be expended over the next 4 to 5 years to do the things that will not be recurring. We need to start to modernize and build the agency capacity, and that means numbers of staff and descriptions of what the staff do. So many of the staff descriptions, in my opinion, need to be upgraded. And we need to direct in the 2023 work The agencies need to be directed to provide the groundwork and lay the foundation for 2024 and beyond. So 2023 is the pivot year. And last slide, Bob. I wanted to remind you all of the water, or inform you of the water advocates' water policy and vision. We need to equitably and effectively adapt to climate change to best sustain what we value: our diverse cultures, our people and economy, food production, and riverine and riparian ecosystems. New Mexicans must act now to secure New Mexico's water future. And supporting the task force recommendations is a great way to do that. Thank you. And Rachel, I think we're ready to take questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And thank you, Norm, for that powerful call to action. We've got just a couple questions in the chat, but folks, don't be shy. Otherwise, I'm going to take up all of the time with questions that I've got, which won't be as much fun. So we do have a question. I know, Hannah, you addressed this already in the chat, but just in case people missed it, could you explain a little bit more who are the New Mexico Water Ambassadors?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Ross, for that question. I meant to speak to this in my comments. You saw on all of our slides, water ambassadors and the task force logo. The concept there is that the task force members themselves are water ambassadors, and that they're part of their role as a task force member is to bring perspectives and information to the table from their communities, and also to relay the work of the task force back to their communities, and also to do the work of advocating and carrying forward the recommendations beyond the final report, which we're working on this month. So that's why we call them water ambassadors.
I love it. We've got some questions coming in. Can you, hold on, sorry, as I'm reading, as we're getting those together, Dr. Clayton, could you talk a little bit more about the consensus process? I know what oftentimes happens is it is a longer process, and people will often avoid it because there is urgency in a lot of things that we're talking about. But can you talk a little bit more about just how that process is so much more valuable, right? And working through that consensus and what really worked well, and maybe some lessons that you've taken from that process.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I'll be happy to. The consensus process was so important because, number one, this cross-section of 29 water task force members, they come from all walks of life, all across the state, and they have different perspectives, and each perspective is extremely valuable, not only to the conversation, but to the decision-making process. So the consensus approach looks to hear those voices, recognize their insights and what they're contributing to the entire outcome, the recommendations that we've covered this evening, and to consider really important questions along the way that we should be asking ourselves, so that we, in a way, the best we can, leave no stone unturned, and we take all challenges before us, the critical issues, those threats, but also those opportunities. What can we do to capitalize on those? And the dialogue gets us there, as well as inviting some outside specialists to talk to us about their knowledge base and better inform where we're headed, because none of us are specialists in every area. So we took advantage of that as well. But the consensus, to get a consensus vote, you have to be 85% or above to get your recommendation labeled as reaching consensus. And you might think that would be easy, but it's rather difficult, actually. Again, a lot of deliberation occurs before you usually get there, and we've spent months. I mean, we began our work in June, and we literally, we finished in October. So, and we're not fully finished yet till we get together for our next meeting on November 17th. But the recommendations are, in my understanding, in their final stage. So I think some of the challenges of consensus, I will speak as just one member, but you know that sometimes it gets hard, it gets frustrating. It's, you know, you can feel the deliberations, you can feel people getting less patient through the deliberative process because it is a struggle. It's like being on a struggle bus. So, you know, you'll think surely now we're going to move to the next one, but we would sometimes spend, I mean, more than an hour deliberating because we were that committed to getting everyone there together. And until we satisfied those questions, those concerns, or even issues with a single word or words in a recommendation or something that was left out that wasn't in, until we satisfied that, we did not move forward. And it can wear you down, but it's certainly in the long run, in the end, that result is amazing. I still just stand in amazement at those recommendations and how we reached that destination. So I hope that's helpful.
No, that's wonderful. And I think, you know, I know we're only barely touching the surface, but those recommendations, it's really clear, you know, the process that went into it and how much better they are for it. So hopefully that's inspiration to everyone to take the time to do consensus for sure. The next question we got is for you, Norm. I know we've got our great call to action, but you know, can you talk a little bit more about what we can do now to move the legislature towards getting this legislation passed in 2023 and really doing that pivot that you're asking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for right now, I think the immediate thing is to vote. And after we voted and after Election Day, I think that everybody who is interested in helping secure New Mexico's water future should contact their state legislators and let them know that water is important, and 2023 is the year to make a serious pivot to take water seriously in New Mexico instead of, these are my views, instead of turning our collective back on our water resources and presuming that the status quo will suffice. As bills are drafted, we need to develop mailing lists of supporters and keep everybody informed. And during the legislative session, we need people to be present and to urge their legislators and the governor to take action. So let me back up just a minute. There's one thing, in addition to contacting your legislators, after Election Day, I highly recommend that everybody write a letter to the governor and tell the governor how important this is.
Wonderful. Thanks, Norm. This next question is for you, Hannah. So I know you all have 8 recommendations from the task force. Are they being prioritized in any particular way, or is the hope that they are all sort of treated and implemented at the same time?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And there's actually 17 across all 3 work groups. So a large slate of recommendations. And as you heard in the report out, there's some overlapping themes. But ultimately that just speaks to the critical need associated with those overlaps, like managing groundwater, for example. So I think that as Norm just said, I don't know the answer to the question is the first thing. We're trying to figure this out. The next thing is, I don't think that there's a sense in the discussions at the executive committee level or with the task force that one or the other recommendations are necessarily more important. I think there's a sense that they're all important and that we need to be strategic in how we're phasing them. And I think that's where Norm's point about the pivot makes a lot of sense, because we're not going to do this all in the 2023 session. And there may be some in that slate of recommendations that are super important, but until we have more agency capacity, like we can't, even if we got the money to do something, we wouldn't be able to move it until we get there. So I think there's a lot of thinking going on right now about what that phasing looks like, but not necessarily that one or the other is more important, but just how we push the whole slate forward. So hopefully that's helpful. And certainly I think as ambassadors, we're hoping that the task force members will be engaging with with communities and with legislators and the governor's office on sort of what that phasing looks like over the next, the run up to the legislative session, right?
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah.
And
One of our-
Rachel, I would add,
Go.
I think one way to think about prioritization is first things first. We need to lay the groundwork in 2023. That's what Hannah said. So that we can implement everything fully within a several year period.
Wonderful. And actually, Norm, one of the next questions is for you anyways. Someone was wondering, how do the recommendations address residential and urban development in terms of water demands in the specific areas?
Well, the recommendations don't single out any particular water use sector. Rather, what they say is that our aggregate demand exceeds many places substantially the resilient supply, if you will. The decisions about who gets how we cut back in the sectors needs to be made in accordance with law in New Mexico, and the law is active water resources management. So one of the recommendations is we need to explain that tool and put it to work. And basically what it is the state engineer needs to administer water. He needs to basically cut off demand that exceeds the available supply. And that's the whole framework for water resources management. I'm happy to talk more about that, but perhaps that'll suffice as a short answer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Norm. And I suppose this is potentially for everyone. So jump in. Have the, and forgive me, I'm assuming it's the New Mexico Water Ambassadors or the task force. Have you all discussed sort of more specific implementation of plans such as via, and I don't know the acronym, so you can poke me for being a water person and probably not knowing this, the AWRM. But yeah, just curious, someone was asking about more of the implementation on these. And obviously we know the first step is the legislature and funding, but any more details to provide there?
And who is that addressed to? Sorry.
I think everyone, but Norm, if you want to take the first stab at it, go for it.
Well, I'm not sure I can. Could you repeat it again?
Yeah, have the ambassadors discussed how to implement plans such as via AWRM?
The answer would be no. Rather, we recognize that that is the statutorily available tool to manage supply and demand that's been approved by the New Mexico Supreme Court. It was in litigation. The rules were in litigation for almost 10 years. And subsequently, the process hasn't been applied. But we're going to be having to invent a whole lot of implementation. And it's going to put a huge burden on agency staff. And that's why we need to start in 2023 by bolstering the staff and getting the staff aligned with the tools to implement the management that New Mexico so badly needs.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hannah or Dr. Clayton, do you want to add anything to that? And thank you, Amy. In case anybody is as terrible with acronyms as me, it's Active Water Resource Management. So thank you for explaining that to me in the chat. I appreciate it. Another question actually for you, Norm, because you mentioned one-time funding coming up. If we don't secure that funding in, like, worst case scenario in this legislative session, what's our path forward? Do we lose the opportunity to access those funds? You know, what's that potentially look like?
Well, as I understand it, and I'm certainly not up to speed on the state finances, other than what all of us know is there's excess revenue right now associated with oil and gas contributions to the state coffers. If we don't get it this year, my understanding from a task force member who represented oil and gas is that we can expect budget surpluses for a few years, at least into the future. Maybe not every year, but many years. And again, what we need to do is to pivot in 2023, capture what we can, and learn our lessons and prepare for 2024.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're at time questions, and I feel like that's a great end for this section anyways, a reminder of that call to action. So everyone here, right, grassroots is the way we do it. So please make a call to the governor, to your legislator, vote first, and then do that to make sure that we are really making the request that they are prioritizing these recommendations, that they are working together to make sure these get implemented and funded and seen through, because this is absolutely a critical issue. So, and we need all of your support in doing that. So reach out to the water advocates as well as you, if you have any specific questions or need support in doing that. I'm sure all of you are pros at contacting your legislators and the governor to make requests on, more water action, but let us know if there's ways that we can support you in that. And I think with that, we're going to conclude and move on to sort of the follow-up with the rest of the Water Advocates board members, which everyone is absolutely welcome to attend. I don't know if Dr. Clayton or Hannah or Norm want to say any last closing things before we shift into that.
Rachel, I would just like to say, I appreciate that you just now revisited this sense of urgency that Norm spoke so eloquently to. I just cannot emphasize enough how very urgent this particular issue is. I mean, water scarcity, the need for water resilience for our state. I can't think of a more pressing issue than this one today. And I know that, the legislative sessions are always inundated with various needs. But to me right now, this is the biggest, greatest transformational need and also survival need for our state, being someone who's from Eastern New Mexico, watching Portales, watching Clovis, watching what's happening in my area and knowing we're fighting for our lives there to ensure that we have the available water needed to sustain an entire community. And we're not alone. So I just want to say the same way every voice counted in the consensus process, as we were doing this work and we heard every voice and we said every voice matters. Honestly, every voice needs to rally right now, come to the table, speak, advocate, and just be fearless about it and relentless. And I don't know what more to say than that. I feel very passionate about this. I wouldn't have served on the water task force if I didn't. It has been a time-intensive process, but I want to just emphasize, I appreciate your emphasis again on taking the bull by the horns and moving forward. It will take every one of us to move this forward. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that powerful close. I couldn't have said it better. So thank you for that. And so if you're starting to head out, if you're getting sleepy and you don't want to join us for the last 30 minutes, just remember to take that survey. We appreciate you greatly for that. And then, the next 30 minutes will be a discussion with the Water Advocates board members about more preparations for the 2023 legislature. So if you're interested in that, definitely stay on and join us.